If that's the case, and I'm sure you are the case, he's got to be a materialist. I'm sure he doesn't believe in the existence of the soul or the mind distinct from the brain. He should have presented that as his argument for atheism. Because if you don't believe in the possibility of an immaterial self or mind, then you don't need this kind of argument to prove atheism. You just say there cannot be such a thing as God because there cannot be minds distinct from physical organisms or brains. So that should have been his argument, but it wasn't. Instead, he presents this argument. And that would then lead us into questions about mind, brain, identity, and how do you deal with the mind? Is the mind reducible to the brain, or is it just a sort of epiphenomenal thing generated by brain processes? And that's, again, another large question that one might discuss. Yes? Okay. These are wonderful questions. Very, very good. His point, I think you probably mostly heard his point, was that this lack of optimality might bespeak limitations in the designer then, limited intelligence or ability or something. Now, this is precisely why people like William Dembski and other intelligent design theorists are not being disingenuous when they say this is not an argument for God. Dembski and these others continually insist we are not arguing that you infer to God on the basis of design, but just to some sort of intelligence, that you need an intelligent designer to explain these things. And he would actually be very sympathetic to your argument. He said there's no way that from these finite products I would be able to prove that this is an omniscient, omnipotent being. And so although many people have characterized intelligent design theory as creationism in a cheap tuxedo, in masquerade, I think that's quite wrong. I think that for people like Dembski and others, they are very sincere when they say we're not proposing this as an argument for God. Now, that having been said, notice how the ground, though, has shifted here significantly in reframing the objection in this way. It now becomes, in a sense, an argument that's rather similar to the problem of evil. Namely, why are there these imperfections, so to speak, in the natural world if they are the product of intelligent design? And here I think what the theist will say is that although we do believe that God is the designer of the universe, he may well have reasons that for having this sort of lack of optimality in the created world. And it wouldn't be hard to think of reasons like that might be appropriate for that. It might produce the sort of world in which human beings would function best. It would provide a kind of ecosystem in which human flourishing could take place, and then ultimately lead people to come to embrace freely God's salvation and to come to a knowledge of God and all the rest. I think that here we begin to get into conjectures that are completely beyond our ability to discern when we say what would be the best sort of world in which God might place human beings so that the maximal number of them could freely come to know him and his salvation. And it might well be a world that is suffused with natural evils, non-optimal designs, earthquakes, tornadoes, things of that sort. And so here I think we begin to get into speculations that really outstrip our abilities. You want to follow up?
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit. It's just
right.
An argument against an argument for theism.
Yes. Yeah, fair enough.
And so the burdens are quite different.
Yes. All right. I was construing the objection as being a sort of demonstration that the designer is lacking in intelligence or ability or something. But, okay. All right. Yeah. Well, look at premise one of Dawkins' argument. I think he's right in saying one of the greatest challenges to the human intellect has been to explain this complex, improbable appearance of design. So this is a question that has occupied people's minds for literally millennia. This is one of the great challenges intellectually. And so I think it's an appropriate question to ask, and particularly with respect to the fine-tuning of the universe in 5 and 6, because there One is not involved in challenging any sort of scientific paradigm like Darwinian evolution or anything of that sort. On the contrary, one is going with the scientific data concerning the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe. And what this would get you, and I think this isn't to be diminished, if this inference is right, it gets you a transcendent, unembodied mind which established the laws of nature with all of their constants and the initial boundary conditions of the universe. I mean, if anybody really believed that there were such a being as this, he would be wide-eyed and open-mouthed with astonishment, because it means that the material world is not all there is. There's some transcendent, intelligent mind beyond the universe. Now, you may not be able to infer to omniscience or omnipotence based on this, but nevertheless, that ought to at least raise the question, if there is such a being as this, maybe he is omnipotent, omniscient, and so forth. Maybe this is the God of classical theism. You see what I mean? So I think we shouldn't minimize what a design inference would get you, even if it doesn't get you all the way to God. All the questions are down here at these two tables, I think. Well, I want to get somebody from another table. Yes, way in the back. If I understand the question correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that what you're saying is, why is the dreaded notion of a God of the gaps unacceptable, but the idea of a naturalism of the gaps perfectly acceptable? And I do think that there is a kind of double standard there. Certainly, a God of the gaps ought to make us feel uncomfortable. This would be a God that is simply used as an ad hoc mechanism, a sort of deus ex machina, a God of the machine, to plug up gaps in scientific knowledge. But you see, the hope expressed in 5 and 6 of the argument is a naturalism of the gap. It seems to me there's really no basis whatsoever physically for thinking that this hope is realistic. In fact, the best evidence of scientific theory that comes out of, say, string theory is that there isn't a kind of theory of everything that will uniquely determine these constants and quantities that are fine-tuned for our existence. And indeed, it's become something of a phenom lately in physical cosmology to talk about the cosmic landscape, which is a possible range of worlds around 10 to the 500th power. That's how many possible worlds string theory permits with respect to these constants and quantities. So there isn't any realistic hope on the horizon that there is going to be some kind of theory of physics that will uniquely determine the values of these constants and boundary conditions. And I do think it's a naturalism of the gaps that we see expressed here, and I think that it's not bad form to point this out and to press the naturalist on this. I think you're quite right. Yes. Okay, I didn't quite understand the question. You have a bit of an accent, and it was difficult for me to... You said something appeared... A documentary film. Oh, the Ben Stein film. I haven't seen it yet, and so I can't comment. But I am anxious to see it. I like Ben Stein. And I will say that I am very deeply disturbed by recent examples of what I regard as religious discrimination in this country. I think probably the most notorious of which was the denial of tenure to Guillermo Gonzalez at Iowa State University. He is a fine astronomer, a fine physical astronomer with a long publication record. And his reputation as a scientist now has been destroyed because they denied him tenure in that department because he wrote a book called The Privileged Planet, in which he argued that the privileged position of our planet in the galaxy evinces intelligent design. He didn't say anything about biological evolution or Darwinism or anything of that sort. It was pure astronomy, and yet he's been denied tenure for this. And the email campaign that went on privately among his colleagues showed that this was because of this commitment to intelligent design. And yet he was, because you can't fire a person for holding to certain religious views. Instead, his integrity as a scientist had to be impugned. His record wasn't good enough. He wasn't a good enough astronomer to be given tenure. And as a result, his reputation and career have been besmirched for reasons pertinent to his private religious beliefs, which I think is just unconscionable. So while I haven't seen the film, I know that there are cases, such as the film illustrates, which are going on in this country and which I think anyone who holds to academic freedom ought to take up a standard against. Well, thank you for coming this morning, and I hope to see some of you tonight as well.